およいよい
Hello, I'm Sheldon Garin. I'm at Princeton University, where I've been actually for the last 40 years or so. I'm a historian of modern Japan. And in the past, I've written a number of books and essays about relations between the very powerful Japanese state and its society from the late 19th century almost to the present. And in the last 20 years or so, I've made somewhat of a shift in my research interests. I remain a historian of Japan, but I also am engaging in something called transnational or global history. And what those are is sometimes we think of them as similar to comparative history, where we're taking two or more societies and we're comparing things in them. But global history or transnational history is a bit more than that. So the current project I'm doing is about the two world wars and the period between them. And it's about the role of the civilian population in the two world wars. And I call the book When Home Fronts Became Battlegrounds. And it's this study, a transnational study of several countries, my own case of Japan, but also Germany, also Britain, to some extent the United States, to some extent France. And what I'm doing there is I'm talking about this concept of home fronts. It's a word that in French you might call l'arrière. You don't quite have the same word, but it's more of an Anglo or a German word, and it means the civilian population at home. And so what I'm doing in this book is I'm looking at the spread of ideas and practices about the mobilization of civilians, about the home front, starting with the First World War, going through the 1920s and 30s, and then culminating in the Second World War, when all of the nations had these very energetic home fronts, mobilization of civilians for various things. And the things I'm most interested in the book is I'm looking at aerial bombardment, something that was new to the 20th century, the bombardment of cities. I'm looking at it both on the offense, the ideas of what we call strategic bombing, trying to win a war by actually bombing cities rather than attacking armies and navies. I'm also looking at the defensive side of that. I'm looking at civil defense. Against bombardment, which was a very active way of organizing home fronts. I'm looking at the issue of food, so food security in terms of the defensive home fronts, things like food rationing and other forms of food distribution. But I'm also looking at offensive strategies, just like bombing, to try and win wars by depriving the enemy's civilian population of enough food by as I said, by blockades. And finally, I'm looking at a very odd concept, but became very dominant, called morale. The morale of civilians, something that didn't exist as a concept before the First World War. But in the First World War and the interwar period and the Second World War, the issue of civilian morale became very important. In long wars, could you sustain people's support for these very resource-intensive mobilizations? Could you get people to save money? Could you get them to work in war industries? And could you generally get them to continue to support their governments, as I said, during long wars when people got very fatigued? And then, just as that's the defense, the offense is other nations offensively tried to destroy the morale of civilians by bombing or by food scarcity or by just making a long war. So these are the various projects. This is what I mean by global history. Now, I was asked also to speak a little bit about an essay I wrote on this topic. It's part of the book, which is on narratives of resilience under aerial bombardment. And so this is a facet of the story that as civilian populations were being attacked from the First World War through the Second World War, there were attempts to try and train the civilian population, so ordinary people in neighborhoods, women, teenagers, older men, people not involved in the fighting, but to train them to be resilient, to stand up to the enemy's onslaughts, particularly the bombing of their neighborhoods and the bombing of their cities. And toward that end, you saw in many countries running from the Spanish Republicans in the Spanish Civil War to the Chinese nationalists in the late 30s when the Japanese were bombing their cities, to Britain during the so-called Blitz in 1940 when the Germans were attacking British cities. And you saw these very active efforts to show, sometimes in a misleading way, that the population wasn't being demoralized, that instead they were standing up, they were defying the enemy's attacks, that they were being brave, and that civilians themselves were fighting back. And toward this end, there were many attempts to tell this story in terms of propaganda, and one of these attempts was an interesting one in Britain during the Blitz, the German attacks in the autumn of 1940. And a movie was produced by the British Ministry of Information called London Can Take It. And there were many such films around the world at the time. But it tried to show in the way that kind of flowed from these other attempts in the Spanish Civil War and the Chinese war with Japan, that the British too could be resilient, that they weren't panicking, that on the contrary, they were forming a sort of uniformed civilian army, that at night when the German attacks came, they were putting on their uniforms as civil defense workers or ambulance drivers or first aid workers, and they were standing up to the German bombing. They weren't getting demoralized. On the contrary, the more the Germans bombed, the film claimed, the tougher the British became, that their morale was actually stiffened rather than being destroyed.
London looks upwards toward the dawn and faces the new day with calmness and confidence. The People's Army go to work as they did in that other comfortable world which came to an end when the invader began to attack the last strongholds of freedom. Not all the services run as they did yesterday, but London manages to get to work on time, one way or another. In the center of the city, the shops are open as usual. In fact, many of them are more open than usual. Dr. Paul Joseph Gibbles said recently that the nightly air raids have had a terrific effect upon the morale of the people of London. The good doctor is absolutely right. Today, the morale of the people is higher than ever before. They are fused together, not by fear, but by a surging spirit of courage, the like of which the world has never known. They know that thousands of them will die, but they would rather stand up and face death than kneel down and face the kind of existence the conqueror would impose upon them.
So it's interesting. I mean, I've been talking about sort of ideas and practices, but even the discourses, even the narratives were traveling around the globe. Let's take, for example, in 1940, the Germans begin to, well, they're about to begin to bomb Britain. So it's the summer of 1940, France has just fallen, and the British are by themselves fighting against Nazi Germany. And Winston Churchill gives a famous speech that everybody knows about. He talks about this will be Britain's finest hour, that the British will stand up, they won't surrender. So it's all, we remember the speech as a very national-centered speech. It's about Britishness. It's about the British are uniquely able to fight the Nazis. But if you read the whole speech, it's very interesting. He says, after he talks about the finest hour, he says, we British must be as brave as the brave people of Barcelona. And you know, you read the speech and you say, well, what's he talking about? Because, I mean, what brave people of Barcelona? Well, he's talking about the Spanish Civil War in 1938. Barcelona gets bombed several times by the Spanish nationalists, Franco, but it's really, they're being bombed by German and Italian air forces that are assisting them. And they're bombing Barcelona. And Barcelona has a fairly good system of civil defense, and so the British are looking at that at the time. So in the end, it doesn't really matter because the brave people of Barcelona lose the war and the Franco's nationalists win the war. And yet 2 years later, Churchill is evoking actually this kind of lost cause, but saying, he's even wondering, he's saying, I hope we British can be as brave as the people in Barcelona. So it's kind of tentative. It's not as confident and nationalistic as you might think, but his reference point is not a national, it's a transnational thing. And he's saying, you know, these are the narratives of resilience as he understands them, and he hopes that Britain can do as well as Spain. So the reason I took a transnational approach is, particularly if you're studying Japan, as I have done for my entire career, lots of things we say about the Japanese, we assume that the Japanese are somehow exceptional or unique. Japanese people often talk about themselves as unique. So in the Second World War, for example, we know that the Japanese people suffered a lot. We know that they had to confront hunger because of food blockades. They had to confront bombing. They had to confront a long war in which many of their family members died. And yet we don't tend to link the Japanese experience with what other civilian populations were doing during the war. So we tend to think that the Japanese were suffering unusually. We tend to think that they were unusually defiant or resilient. We often think that they were fanatical, that they were doing things that nobody else was doing. And instead, we find out that while it's true that the Japanese population did suffer during the war, it was not a unique experience. This is what German people were doing. This is what British people were doing. This is what Soviets were doing, that the forms of mobilization of the home front during the Second World War were more similar than one might think, despite the enormous differences in their political regimes, that liberal Britain and authoritarian bureaucratic Japan or Nazi Germany in everyday life were behaving somewhat similarly. They were all doing civil defense. They were all doing blackout drills. They were blackening shutting the lights off in their houses. They all had food ration coupons. They were all doing the evacuation of school children from bombed cities. And they were all engaging in what's called total war. These were countries, Britain, Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, Japan, that did not give up easily, that decided to fight total wars, meaning that they were not going to surrender, that they were going to fight to the end. And so it's not a uniquely Japanese thing. And we need to understand it not only in comparison, but the fact that even the ideas behind this enormous suffering and persistence were ideas that were being transmitted around the world, that the only way you could win a war in the age of total war was to have your civilian population entirely supportive of you. So thus we see things that look fanatical, and they are in fact fanatical, that they would fight to the end and fight to the death. It's just that the Japanese were not exceptionally fanatical. So were the others.